When the Texas legislature convenes every 2 years, its primary responsibility is to set the only piece of legislation that lawmakers are required to pass, the state's budget. The budget is a moral document that demonstrates our state priorities and will affect everyone in Texas, from school children to our grandparents. Texas's money comes from many different sources. In 2010-2011, about 35% of Texas's funding came from the federal government. 42% came from general revenue, the technical name for state taxes, and the remaining monies came from other revenue sources. 67% of the funds in general revenue come from the state sales tax. Licenses and fees make up about 11% of general revenue. Business tax makes up 8%, and oil and gas taxes make up 5%. Texas funds a wide variety of services. Public education, higher education, and health and human services make up more than 2/3 of the budget. Some of the health and human services Texas provides include insurance for low-income children, assistance for people with disabilities, and reimbursements to nursing homes. Right now, Texas legislators are trying to write the 2012-2013 budget, but there is a revenue crisis in Texas. The difference between what the state will collect in revenue and the minimum amount needed to fund current services is $27 billion.
Because it's clear that at least one of the reasons why the state of Texas does such a terrible job of providing for health and human services and public education and higher education and transportation and parks and prisons and everything else is because we don't have a revenue system that's up to the task. We are not producing enough money from our state and local tax system to do what we need to do, to take care of people who need help now and to prepare our children for the future.
How do we fix this problem? Some advocates suggest that we make cuts to Texas's services and programs. The current House budget makes severe cuts to every aspect of state government. For example, the House budget zeroes out $6.7 million from a program that provides services to children with autism, eliminates $223 million in funding for pre-kindergarten grants and early childhood school readiness programs, and could cause about 96,000 school employees across Texas to lose their jobs. Cuts alone are not the answer. Texas has at least $9 billion in the Economic Stabilization Fund, also called the Rainy Day Fund, that we should spend to help fill the hole. The Rainy Day Fund is a self-replenishing source of revenue. When oil and gas tax revenue exceeds the amount collected in 1987, the excess tax revenue is directly deposited into the fund.
So we are having a problem caused by the recession, but luckily we have a way to deal with that. We have the Rainy Day Fund. The Rainy Day Fund was created exactly to deal with things like temporary economic dislocation. Its official name is the Economic Stabilization Fund. We call it the Rainy Day Fund, but you can tell by its official name what its purpose is. It's to just bridge the gap when a recession or something other economic problem knocks down revenue temporarily. That's what's happened to us, and that's why they need to use all of the Rainy Day Fund to write this budget and not try to do it with cuts alone. They're having a terrible time up there now trying to decide between school children and nursing homes, making choices that don't have to be made because we have the Rainy Day Fund in place to take care of those things.
Ultimately, Texas will need to find more sources of revenue. We can do that through closing tax loopholes and raising fees. However, Texas has a structural deficit in its tax code that must be fixed.
The structural deficit, as I understand it, Senator, would be going back about 5 years into the past, and the structural deficit would be the actions that the legislature took to relieve local property taxes and replace that money substantially with an increase in our business tax. The outcome of that was the business tax did not bring in as much as was expected, and property tax relief cost a little bit more than was expected, thus leaving a gap between the two.
So going forward, how do you get beyond a structural deficit?
Well, going forward, it's still...
get beyond it, how do you get to where you don't have a shortfall as we go meet everybody in?
Well, going forward, of course, that still exists. And if the legislature chooses to do so, it can address that, of course, Senator.
But as we talk today, we have a structural deficit, and the forecast will have one until we address it.
Yes, sir.
Our biggest problem is our structural deficit, and we've got a tax system that is no longer equal, is no longer uniform, and it's not very efficient. With any budget that we pass, even the budget that the House passed, has a large structural deficit that we have failed to address, and I think as government officials, we're failing in our duty to the public.
How does Texas's proposed budget affect your community? If you had to make these difficult decisions, what would you do differently than the Texas legislature?
Aren't we a community richly blessed by our Creator and committed to serve one another? Don't those of us who have much have a powerful obligation to care for our most vulnerable, the ones who will be hurt the most by the cuts that some imagine? Is slicing and dicing a budget really the very best that we can do in our great state? As a United Methodist pastor, my own tradition suggests that God has a vision for humanity that far exceeds our imagination. As our elected leaders, I hope and I pray that you will challenge us to take courageous, even sacrificial steps together, that you'll find creative ways to fund all of these programs so that we might live not out of scarcity, but out of that promised abundance. Thank you.